The arrival, the first scream, was never recorded in any official ledger. No witness wrote it down. No clergyman preserved it in the neat calligraphy of a parish register. It was swallowed by the woods themselves, dense, black, and endless, rising, for an instant, above the skeletal branches of upstate New York before being lost to the wind. What remains more than a century and a half later is the echo. 143 unmarked graves beneath the rotting beams of an abandoned church. Every skeleton bore signs of torment. Every fracture, every carved bone whispered the same truth, that a family once walked among us who believed suffering was not tragedy, but salvation. That family was the Ravencrofts. But their story does not begin with corpses unearthed in 1862. It begins earlier, in the summer of 1825, when 3 men descended upon the quiet farming community of Ravenwood with money in their purses, conviction in their eyes, and darkness in their souls. Their names, Ezra, Silas, and Caleb Ravencroft, would become synonymous with one of the most chilling religious cults in American history, and what they built in those woods was not simply a church. It was a machine, an engine of obedience, blood, and terror that thrived in plain sight for decades. A town ripe for belief, Ravenwood was the kind of place most travelers forgot the moment they left. 300 souls at most, farming their stubborn earth, cutting timber, trading barley, flax, and lumber with the villages south toward Albany. Founded in 1803 by Hudson Valley families hungry for fresh land, it was little more than a scatter of wooden homes pressed between the rolling hills and endless forests. But there was something else stirring there, something less tangible. The Second Great Awakening, the wildfire of religious revival that swept through America in the early 19th century, had set the region ablaze. Preachers thundered from wagons and hilltops. Whole towns would fall weeping to their knees in a single night, begging forgiveness, convinced God's hand was pressing down upon them. They called this part of New York the burned-over district, as if faith itself had scorched the land clean. To outsiders it looked like religious fervor. To the Ravencrofts it looked like opportunity. The brothers, they arrived in Ravenwood like actors stepping onto a stage, each playing his role with perfect precision. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, was the voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes so dark they seemed bottomless, he spoke with an authority that made men stand straighter and women avert their gaze. To hear him thunder about the wages of sin was to believe you had been seen through, your soul measured, your sins weighed. Deacon Silas, 3 years younger, was the scholar, slender, bespectacled. With ink-stained fingers he kept meticulous notes, quoting scripture with precision, recording names, dates, offerings. He gave shape to the brothers' fire, making their doctrine seem orderly, intellectual, inevitable, and then there was Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35, pale as though he had never known the sun, with eyes of an icy, unnatural blue. He spoke in whispers that traveled through crowded rooms, his words curling into ears like smoke. When he claimed visions, his body would tremble, his eyes roll back, and his voice would shift into tones not quite human. Some swore they heard angels. Others heard only madness. Together, the Ravencrofts were irresistible. The Church of the Pure Spirit, with startling speed, they purchased a large tract of land on Ravenwood's outskirts and began construction of their sanctuary. Locals expected the usual white clapboard meeting house, humble, modest, a reflection of New England's puritanical sensibilities. What rose instead was a dark stone structure, unlike anything in the region, an octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, crowned with a towering steeple that seemed to claw at the sky. And most unnerving of all, there were no windows. Inside, lanterns cast controlled pools of light on the polished wood floor, where geometric patterns had been carved so deep they looked like scars. "The Spirit has called us here," Ezra announced to the curious townsfolk at the church's first gathering. "Not for comfort, not for ease, but for purification. Only through tribulation can the vessel be made worthy." Some laughed at first. Some walked away, shaking their heads, but others, Tired farmers, grieving widows, restless youth felt a strange pull, a need, the doctrine of suffering at. First, their message seemed simple, even familiar. Salvation required suffering. They quoted scripture about Christ's wounds, about refinement through fire, about the body as a vessel of sin. But the Ravencrofts did not mean metaphor. The flesh must be broken for the spirit to soar, Silas explained with calm conviction, and Caleb, eyes rolled white, would add in his rasping whisper, "The spirit does not comfort. The spirit devours." Newcomers were asked to endure small trials, fasting, sleepless nights of prayer, immersion in freezing water to symbolize drowning the sinful self. But slowly, methodically, these trials escalated. Cuts instead of chills, burns instead of baptisms. Pain not as punishment but as passage. To outsiders, the church was charitable, industrious, strangely prosperous. But inside, its members were being conditioned like cattle led to slaughter, their minds reshaped to accept cruelty as blessing. Margaret Wilkins, one of the earliest to join, was Margaret Wilkins, a widow who had buried her husband and 2 children in the same winter. Grief had hollowed her out until, by her own account, she stood one morning on the edge of the frozen river, ready to let the ice close over her. Ezra found her there. He looked into her eyes and said, "Your suffering is not meaningless. It is the Spirit's fire preparing you for greatness." Later, in a journal investigators would recover decades after her death, Margaret wrote, "For the first time since the earth swallowed my family, I felt something besides despair. I felt chosen." The catacombs by 1829, membership had swelled to nearly 100. Donations poured in, property was signed over, and the Ravencrofts began their most ambitious project, an underground network of chambers beneath the church. Dug by loyal followers, these cellars stretched outward in secret, forming a labyrinth of tunnels, alcoves, and sanctums. Few outsiders ever glimpsed them, but those who did spoke of walls slick with moisture, passages lit only by tallow candles, and chambers that smelled not of earth, but of chemicals. It was in these catacombs, hidden from the daylight world, that the Ravencrofts' true work began. December 21st, 1829, the winter solstice. The longest night of the year. Ezra summoned the entire congregation to the sanctuary, nearly 150 souls, as snow piled outside and lantern flames flickered against the scarred wooden floor. Prophet Caleb claimed to have received a vision, a revelation, of the next level of purification. Witnesses later described the air as suffocating, thick with incense and candle smoke. 12 great candles marked a spiral on the floor, winding toward a raised platform at the center. And then Caleb entered. His body jerked unnaturally, his eyes rolling white, his voice spilling guttural sounds that made even the faithful shudder. He collapsed, then rose again. And in his human voice he spoke the words that would shatter Ravenwood forever. "The Spirit has chosen 3 among you for the first ascension." He named them Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, Rebecca Winters, 3 recent converts. They were led to the center of the spiral, stripped, bound to inverted crosses, and the trials began. What followed would stretch through the night, searing itself into the memories of every witness. Air, earth, fire, water, the 7 trials of purification. And just before dawn, as the victims convulsed and screamed in tongues no one recognized, Elder Ezra raised his arms and declared, "They are emptied, they are vessels, and the Spirit has filled them." The 3 bodies went still. Their eyes remained open. Their lips moved with words that were not their own. By sunrise they were dead, and Ravenwood had taken its first steps into hell. The Chamber of Saints, the morning after the first ascension, Ravenwood was not the same. On the surface, the town carried on. Farmers drove oxen through frost-bitten fields. The blacksmith's hammer rang against iron. Smoke curled from chimneys. But inside the church compound, something had shifted. The faithful no longer spoke of suffering as burden, but as blessing. The screams of Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca were not condemned, but revered. and the Ravencroft brothers, who had demanded obedience before, now demanded worship. The doctrine deepens. Elder Ezra wasted no time redefining what the congregation had witnessed. They were not killed, he thundered from the pulpit. They ascended. They crossed the threshold and entered the presence of the pure spirit, unburdened by the rot of flesh. Some wept with terror, others with joy. A few quietly slipped away, never to return. But those who remained, utterly changed. Deacon Silas, his spectacles glinting in lantern light, provided scripture to fortify the horror. He read from Corinthians about bodies sown in weakness and raised in power, from Peter about suffering refining the faithful like fire purifies gold. But then he added verses that no one else recognized, words he claimed were from ancient scrolls, though they were in truth his own inventions. The message was simple. The Spirit demanded pain, demanded blood, and those chosen for elevation should be envied, not pitied. And Caleb, the whispering prophet, stalked through the aisles, pale fingers brushing the shoulders of trembling followers, promising them, if you endure, the Spirit will claim you, and you will shine brighter than angels. The catacombs expanded. The weeks that followed, the brothers began the next phase of their work, expanding the tunnels beneath the church. The digging was done not by hired men, no outsider was allowed, near the sanctum, but by the most devoted members, those who had witnessed the first ascension without faltering. Night after night, they descended with pickaxes and shovels, carving out new chambers by candlelight, their breath fogging the air as damp soil closed around them. The tunnels grew into a honeycomb of rooms, each with a purpose. A chamber for fasting and isolation, a chamber for the trials of purification, a chamber where corpses were not buried but preserved. It was here, in what came to be known as the Chamber of Saints, that the dead of the first ascension were placed. Their bodies were washed, oiled, and arranged not in coffins but on slabs of stone. Lanterns burned low, casting shadows across their pale, lifeless forms. Followers were led down to kneel before them, whispering prayers, believing they were in the presence of holy relics. Margaret Wilkins, the grieving widow who had once nearly drowned herself in the frozen river, wrote in her journal, I touched Rebecca's hand. It was cold as marble. But Elder Ezra told me it was the chill of glory, that her body was only the husk of her purified soul. I believed him. I believed it with every fiber of my being. The conditioning of the flock psychologists today would call it indoctrination. The gradual boiling of the frog, the slow exchange of morality for devotion. But to the Ravencrofts it was art. Ezra used fear and awe, alternating between fire and brimstone sermons and tender assurances that obedience would bring eternal reward. Silas buried followers in scripture and pseudo-scholarship, overwhelming them with words until doubt felt like ignorance. And Caleb offered intimacy. He whispered confessions in the ears of widows, children, drunks, anyone hollow enough to be filled. His eyes rolled back, his voice dropped into guttural tones, and he claimed to channel the Spirit directly into their bones. Each brother targeted a different wound in the human soul. And together, they bound their congregation tighter than chains. By 1830, nearly 200 souls called themselves children of the pure Spirit. Whispers of doubt. Not everyone was blind. Thomas Hartford, the blacksmith who had witnessed the first ascension, felt sickness in his gut every time the congregation cheered a scream. He began keeping mental notes. How many had vanished since joining? How many families stopped receiving letters? How many fresh graves went unmarked in the woods outside town? But when he voiced his unease, Caleb appeared at his doorstep. Your doubts are the Spirit testing you, Caleb whispered, standing too close, his pale breath frosting in the night air. Do not fail, or you will burn alone, Thomas. You will burn outside the flock. Hartford said nothing more. He swallowed his fear and watched as his neighbors fell deeper under the Ravencroft spell. The second ascension on the summer solstice of 1830, the Ravencrofts unveiled a new ceremony. 3 more were chosen, this time a young boy, a pregnant woman, and an old man nearing 80. Their suffering was framed as a balance: youth, life, and death, each made pure through pain. Witnesses later testified that the boy screamed for his mother until his voice cracked, that the woman sobbed prayers to the Virgin, and that the old man went silently, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he had already left his body. And when it was done, when all three lay lifeless and broken, the congregation did not mourn. They applauded. "Through suffering comes purity," they chanted. "Through purity comes elevation." Ezra raised his arms like a conductor guiding an orchestra of madness. Silas wrote the names in his ledger. Caleb whispered into the ears of the corpses until their mouths twitched with death's parody of speech. The Chamber of Saints welcomed three more. The stench of chemicals. By 1832, the Chamber of Saints no longer stank of rot. Silas had begun experimenting with methods of preservation: alcohol, turpentine, unfamiliar powders imported at great cost from Philadelphia. The bodies did not decay. Their skin puckered and dried, their faces tightened into masks, but they did not rot. Followers claimed this was proof of sanctity. Elizabeth Carver, who would later escape and testify, described her first visit. "I thought I would gag from the odor, sharp and sweet, like sickness hidden beneath perfume. But when I saw them, the saints lying in rows, their mouths frozen open in eternal prayers, I wept. I thought it was holy. Now I know it was hell." The fragile mask of respectability. Outwardly, the Church of the Pure Spirit flourished. They donated to temperance societies, hosted picnics, taught children to read scripture. To visiting preachers, they were a model congregation: orderly, generous, zealous. But at night, beneath the stone sanctuary, the Ravencroft's doctrine deepened. Trials grew harsher, elevations became more frequent, and whispers spread through Ravenwood of people who went to church and never came home. Some families left town entirely. Others chose silence over suspicion. The Ravencrofts had built more than a congregation. They had built a fortress of faith, fear, and blood. On the night of December 21st, 1832, the third anniversary of the First Ascension, Elder Ezra gathered the congregation once more in the windowless sanctuary, but this time, the chosen were not widows or orphans. This time they were children. And as Caleb whispered over their small, trembling forms, Thomas Hartford realized the truth. Ravenwood was not a town anymore. It was a sacrifice waiting to happen. The screams that followed would never be forgotten. Flesh for knowledge. By the mid-1830s, the Church of the Pure Spirit no longer looked like an eccentric sect clinging to the edges of Ravenwood. It looked like an empire. The compound had swelled far beyond its original stone sanctuary. Dormitories, rows for unmarried members. Workshops churned out furniture, tools, and textiles branded with the church's symbol, a spiral coiled inward, etched onto every product. Families lived in neat rows of cabins along the compound's perimeter, and children recited verses of purification in classrooms where slates were stained with chalk and prayer. To outsiders, it was a picture of prosperity, a self-sufficient village, industrious and pious. But to those inside, it was something else entirely, a crucible of obedience where every detail of daily life was bent toward suffering, and in the shadows beneath the earth, the Ravencrofts were perfecting their most macabre innovation. The chamber. System. By 1835, the tunnels beneath the church had grown into a labyrinth. Each chamber had a name, a function, and a terrible purpose. The Chamber of Preparation, a bare, windowless room where candidates for elevation were locked in isolation. They fasted, they prayed. They were denied sleep until their minds buckled. The Chamber of Trials, filled with restraints, implements, and the instruments of torment. Heated iron, buckets of freezing water, carved wooden frames. Here the 7 trials of purification were administered. The Chamber of Ascension, the ritual space where the final killing took place. Inverted crosses, spiral carvings, candles arranged in constellations. The Chamber of Saints, the morgue and reliquary, where corpses were arranged like grotesque statues. some mummified, some skeletonized, all revered. To the congregation, these places were holy. To investigators decades later, they were something closer to an assembly line of death. The first sales, the Ravencrofts faced a practical problem. The Chamber of Saints was filling too quickly. Dozens of bodies lined the catacombs by the late 1830s, each one taking space, each one a lingering reminder that human flesh, however sanctified, still decays. It was Silas who devised the solution. His voracious appetite for books had already led him into medical texts, journals from Europe, reports of anatomical studies. He knew the truth. Medical schools across America were desperate for cadavers. Executed criminals and unclaimed paupers provided too few. Professors complained of shortages. Students learned anatomy by carving wax models or dissecting pigs. There was a market, and Silas meant to corner it. Through intermediaries, he established contact with agents in Albany and Philadelphia. At first, a handful of bodies were quietly exchanged, unclaimed vessels as Silas labeled them. Payment was made in cash, delivered discreetly. The brothers told their followers these bodies had been donated to the advancement of the spirit. The congregation, conditioned to accept suffering as holy, wept with gratitude. But Silas's private ledger, later uncovered by investigators, tells the truth in ink. 1837, 2 vessels, delivered to Albany Medical College, payment $120, condition satisfactory. 1838, 4 vessels, sent to Philadelphia, payment $300. Noted, professors praised preparation. The Ravencrofts had found a way to turn murder into profit. Margaret Wilkins' testimony. Margaret Wilkins, the widow who had joined early, remained one of the most devoted followers. But in her journal, which would one day be pried from a hidden drawer in her cabin, doubt began to creep. We were told their bodies were holy, that they must remain among us as saints, but now they are carted away in wagons at night. Elder Ezra says it is the Spirit's will, that knowledge itself can be holy. Yet I wonder, if their souls are pure, why must their bones be sold? Her doubts remained buried beneath layers of fear and reverence. She stayed. She obeyed. But her words, discovered decades later, provided one of the earliest cracks in the facade. The transformation of Caleb while Ezra remained the voice, and Silas the scholar, Caleb was changing. His visions had grown darker, more violent. He began scrawling anatomical drawings on scraps of parchment, bones labeled with strange symbols, diagrams of lungs pierced, hearts carved, skulls opened. He claimed the spirit was revealing the map of the soul, showing him how pain flowed through the body like rivers through earth. His journals, discovered years later, were filled with chilling fragments. The spirit pools behind the eyes. The tongue is its door, the lungs its bellows. To strike one is to move the others. Followers who once found his whispers comforting now feared them. His body shook violently during his trances, his eyes rolling back so far that only white remained. Sometimes when he returned from these episodes, he would speak of things that made even Ezra pause. The child's suffering is the purest, he rasped once before an audience of stunned worshippers. Their cries carried directly to the spirit's ear. From that day forward, children were no longer exempt from elevation. The monthly elevations by 1840, the Ravencroft ceremonies were no longer rare spectacles. They were regular events. Each month, at least one elevation took place, sometimes more. On solstices and equinoxes, entire families were chosen. Ezra framed it as ultimate honor. To give a son, a daughter, a wife, a grandfather, was to show faith beyond measure. Elizabeth Carver, who would later escape, described the moment she realized the depth of the conditioning. When they announced that Sister Abigail's little boy had been chosen, she did not scream. She did not run. She lifted her hands to heaven and cried with joy. She thanked the Spirit for selecting her child. And the congregation applauded. Pain had become worship. Death had become sacrament. Medical complicity, the bodies delivered to medical. Schools carried evidence of trauma, burns, fractures, scarring. Some professors questioned it, but others, more curious than cautious, admired the preservation. One letter, dated 1844 and later recovered from Silas's hidden correspondence, came from a prominent physician in Philadelphia. The specimens received from your church are of exceptional quality. Unusual in preparation, most useful for study. The patterns of injury are curious, suggesting systematic observation prior to death. Might I inquire further about your methods? The Ravencrofts had not only found customers, they had found collaborators. The Garden in 1840. Silas purchased a farmhouse 40 miles from Ravenwood under a false name. He called it the Garden. Here the brothers conducted experiments too prolonged, too grisly to risk in the church itself. Subjects were kept alive for weeks. Children especially were prized for what Caleb called their clarity. The farmhouse, when investigators finally uncovered it in 1851, revealed small cells for juveniles, medical equipment, and journals describing experiments in chilling detail, but in the 1840s no one knew. The garden existed only in whispers among the brothers and in Caleb's muttered ravings. The first rumors. The prosperity of the church drew admiration from afar, but within Ravenwood, unease simmered. Too many faces disappeared. Too many children were said to have ascended but were never buried. Too many wagons rolled out at night, heavy with unholy cargo. Some townsfolk whispered of witchcraft. Others believed the Ravencrofts were angels in disguise. But suspicion was rising, and suspicion, to the Ravencrofts, was dangerous. One summer evening in 1847, a postal inspector named James Thornhill passed through Ravenwood investigating irregular banking deposits. He noted large sums in cash, far too large for a farming community, and he asked a simple question. Why does a country church deposit more than a small city bank? That question would unravel everything, but before it did, the Ravencrofts had a final decade to perfect their empire of suffering, and in that decade, the Chamber of Saints would overflow. The breaking of the prophet. The year was 1847, and the Ravencrofts' mask of respectability had never seemed more convincing. To visitors, the Church of the Pure Spirit was thriving. Neat gardens ringed the compound. Children sang hymns that echoed sweetly across the fields. Donations flowed not only from members but from sympathizers impressed by the church's orderliness and charity. But beneath that polished surface the ground was crumbling. James Thornhill. James Thornhill was not a man given to superstition. He was a postal inspector, a civil servant whose life revolved around numbers, signatures, and ledgers. He was trained to see irregularities where others saw routine. In the summer of 1847, Thornhill's task was simple: investigate financial discrepancies in several upstate towns. He arrived in Ravenwood with no thought of cults, ascensions, or preserved corpses. But within 2 days he noticed something strange. The church's banking patterns didn't match its size. Enormous cash deposits appeared at irregular intervals, like waves of money flowing in, then dispersing again toward Albany, Philadelphia, even Baltimore. Too much for tithes, Thornhill noted in his report. These are institutional sums, not the gifts of farmers. He asked questions. The townsfolk answered vaguely. The Ravencrofts smiled politely, offering him meals, hospitality, and rehearsed explanations. But Thornhill left Ravenwood with a ledger full of contradictions and something else. A name. Martha Simmons. Martha Simmons' secret. Martha had been part of the church since her teenage years. She had seen friends disappear, had heard their cries swallowed by the catacombs, and had lost her sister to an elevation in 1846. She had stayed silent. Until Thornhill. At first, she refused to speak. The Spirit sees all, she whispered, and those who betray it are cursed. But Thornhill pressed gently, showing her his records, his suspicions, his determination, and slowly, Martha's dam broke. She spoke of the rituals, of the Chamber of Saints, of the way her sister's body had been arranged like a doll for prayer, her skin puckered with burns, her eyes sewn shut. She spoke of children taken, of screams muffled beneath hymnals, of wagons that creaked into the night with human cargo. Thornhill wrote in his journal, "Her claims so outlandish that I would have dismissed them entirely, had they not aligned perfectly with the irregularities I had already traced. If even half of what she says is true, the church in Ravenwood is a slaughterhouse." Martha's testimony was the first official crack in the Ravencroft's carefully built facade. The madness of Caleb around this same time, Prophet Caleb's mind, began to unravel completely. He had always been prone to visions and trances, but now they became violent. He clawed at his own skin, muttering that spirits were trying to crawl out of him. He scribbled incomprehensible diagrams on the walls of his chamber, spirals within spirals, organs pierced by black lines, children drawn with hollow eyes. Witnesses later testified that he would collapse mid-sermon, convulsing as though struck by invisible lightning, then rise again, speaking in a tongue no one recognized. But worse than the gibberish were the moments of lucidity. "The chambers are hungry," he whispered to a young follower one evening. "But the saints are restless. They whisper back to me in the night." The boy fled the church that night and never returned. By 1850, even Ezra and Silas could no longer control him. They confined Caleb to the deepest tunnel, a chamber so far beneath the earth that his screams could not be heard above ground. But madness has a way of escaping confinement. Dr. William Garrett, the Ravencroft's dealings with medical schools had grown bolder. Silas, always meticulous, refined his preservation techniques until their specimens were unlike any others. Professors marveled at the condition of the bodies, at the unusual scars that hinted at experimentation. One doctor, however, did not marvel. He recoiled. Dr. William Garrett, a physician in Albany, received several cadavers through agents connected to the Ravencrofts. When he examined them, he noticed something chilling. The injuries had occurred before death. Bones fractured, then healed slightly. Skin burned in patterns, not accidents. Lungs scarred from repeated drowning. These were not the signs of natural disease or sudden accident. These were deliberate. Garrett wrote confidentially to colleagues, "These bodies show evidence of systematic, ante-mortem trauma. I fear they were not given to science after death, but made into science before it." His words would later become crucial evidence. But in 1850, they were only whispers in professional circles. The breaking point on June 17, 1851, Prophet Caleb escaped. How he freed himself from the underground restraints is still a mystery. Some say a follower pitied him and unlocked the door. Others claim he gnawed through his bindings like a rat. What is certain is this: he emerged from the woods naked, his body carved with self-inflicted wounds, his face streaked with blood. He staggered into Ravenwood's town square during a midsummer gathering, shrieking about the saints, the chambers, the children. "The blood of the purified strengthens the spirit," he screamed before a crowd of horrified onlookers. 207 vessels have ascended. Their bones sing beneath the ground. The people of Ravenwood, who had whispered suspicions for years, finally heard confirmation from the prophet's own mouth. Authorities seized him, at first believing him a lunatic. But when he named himself Caleb Ravencroft, when he described the underground chambers in chilling detail, when he drew maps no sane man could invent, the gears of justice began to grind. Thornhill, notified at once, hurried to Ravenwood. He interviewed Caleb and found a man teetering between gibbering madness and unnerving clarity. One moment, Caleb raved about spirits whispering in the walls. The next, he sketched precise floor plans of the church catacombs. And when Thornhill asked him how many had died, Caleb answered without hesitation, 217. But the spirit is still hungry. The cleansing flame elder Ezra and deacon Silas knew what Caleb's capture meant. Within hours, they enacted a plan long prepared for such a crisis. They called it the cleansing flame. Members of the inner circle rushed into the catacombs, removing ledgers, money, and the most recent corpses. Water was diverted from a nearby stream to flood certain tunnels, and in the sanctuary above carefully placed torches set fire to the wooden beams. By the time authorities arrived with a warrant 2 days later, the church smoldered. The congregation stood weeping among the ashes. Elder Ezra greeted investigators with open arms, his voice a perfect balance of grief and piety. "God has tested us with fire," he said. "First with my beloved brother's affliction, and now with this terrible blaze. But faith shall rise from ashes." It was a performance worthy of the pulpit. But when investigators finally broke into the half-flooded tunnels below, they found what the fire had not consumed: restraints bolted to stone, tools warped by heat but recognizable, chemical jars reeking of alcohol and turpentine. And in one chamber, beyond water and smoke, dozens of corpses arranged in eternal postures of prayer, the Chamber of Saints. Federal investigator Daniel Blackwood, sent to oversee the case, wrote in his first report, "The scene defies all language. Men and women posed as though alive, children seated as though at play, yet every one of them bearing marks of violent death. This is no church. This is a charnel house masquerading as faith. And yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, Ezra and Silas were calm. They smiled as they were questioned. They denied nothing. Instead, Elder Ezra leaned forward across the table and said something that chilled Blackwood to his core. "You think this is the end? Investigator, this is only the beginning. You have no idea how far the spirit has spread." The trial of the unholy brothers. The trial began on January 12, 1852, in Albany, New York. From the moment the courthouse doors opened, the case was unlike anything the American public had ever seen. Newspapers had been preparing the ground for months, feeding the public lurid scraps. Stories of catacombs lined with corpses, children taken in the night, and a prophet shrieking in madness before a town square. By the first day, thousands crowded the courthouse lawn. Vendors hawked pamphlets, claiming to reveal secret teachings of the Ravencrofts. Peddlers sold crude woodcuts of Ezra and Silas, their faces distorted into demonic caricatures. Some came out of horror, others came for entertainment. The newspapers called it the trial of the unholy brothers. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally fevered. Security was tight, bayonets gleaming, rifles stacked in corners, but the gallery remained packed. Ladies fanned themselves, pale with anticipation. Gentlemen clutched notebooks, eager to record every word. At the defense table sat the brothers. Silas, thin and pale, seemed diminished, rarely lifting his eyes from the table. He whispered to his attorneys, but otherwise remained still. Ezra, by contrast, was unshaken. He sat upright, his black eyes scanning the room with unnerving calm. When witnesses described atrocities, he smiled faintly, as though pleased at their accuracy. It was a smile that would haunt jurors' dreams. The prosecution's case over 6 weeks. The prosecution built its case methodically. Survivors testified. Former members described the indoctrination, the rituals, the steady escalation of suffering. Elizabeth Carver's voice trembled as she recounted the moment she first saw the Chamber of Saints. "I wept, believing it beautiful. Only later did I realize I had mistaken horror for holiness." Medical experts testified. Dr. Garrett presented his examinations, detailing the anti-mortem injuries. "These bodies were not gifts of the dead," he declared. "They were sacrifices of the living." Financial records were shown. Ledgers revealed payments from medical schools. Each entry bore Silas's precise hand. Dates, names, prices, the cold arithmetic of death. Families spoke. Mothers and fathers described children who vanished into the church. Letters from the lost were read aloud, letters filled with unnatural joy, clearly written under duress. One mother, Sarah Wilkinson, spoke of her daughter Emma, only 16. The girl had written that she was chosen for a special blessing. Weeks later, Ezra told her she had ascended. "I begged to see her," Wilkinson cried in court. "They said her body was too holy. I never saw her again." Her testimony left even hardened newspapermen in tears. The defense attorneys, desperate, clung to a single argument: religious freedom. The Constitution guarantees every man the right to worship as he sees fit. William Hargrove, their lead attorney, proclaimed. These rituals, however shocking, were acts of faith, consented to by believers who freely chose their path. It was an audacious strategy, but it began to collapse under cross-examination. Survivors described coercion, deception, and drug-laced rituals that clouded minds and erased resistance. The prosecution unveiled records from the garden, proving that many victims had not even been members of the church, but abducted strangers. Consent, it became clear, had nothing to do with it. Ezra speaks on March the 2nd. The trial took its darkest turn. Against his lawyer's advice, Ezra demanded to testify. The judge hesitated. The gallery leaned forward. Finally, the gavel struck. Permission granted. What followed was less testimony than sermon. For 4 hours, Ezra spoke. He did not deny the charges. He did not plead for mercy. He explained. He described suffering as the purest form of consciousness, death as a transformation, not an end, pain as the refining fire of the soul. He spoke of children as vessels, unclouded by the world, their suffering most useful to the spirit. At times his words had the rhythm of scripture, at others the precision of science. He quoted the Bible and medical texts in the same breath, weaving theology and anatomy into a single philosophy of cruelty. Death comes to all, he told the stunned courtroom. We merely gave it purpose. Their screams were not agony but prayer. Their broken bodies were not ruined but refined. We elevated them into instruments of understanding. When prosecutor James Sullivan asked about the children found at the garden, Ezra's reply sent a shudder through the room. The young vessel receives the Spirit most purely. Their cries illuminate paths others fear to tread. We honored them by allowing their pain to teach us. The gallery erupted, screams, sobs, shouts of rage. One man, later identified as Harold Winters, whose son had vanished in 1847, leapt from the benches with a knife. He was dragged away before he reached Ezra. Ezra did not flinch. He merely smiled. You see, he said softly, even now truth provokes violence, always has, always will. The verdict after Ezra's chilling sermon, the defense presented no more witnesses. Silas declined to testify, his silence contrasting with his brother's brazen performance. On March 10th, after only 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty, on all counts. Judge William Blackwood pronounced sentence, death by hanging. Their crimes are an offense not only against the laws of man, he declared, but against God, against the very moral foundation upon which society rests. The execution was scheduled for April 15th, but fate had other plans. The jail fire on the night of April 7th, a fire broke out in the Albany jail. Flames roared through the corridors. Guards and inmates alike perished in the smoke. When the ashes cooled, 2 discoveries shook the nation. Deacon Silas was dead, identified only by the melted rings found on his charred body, and Elder Ezra was gone. Whether he burned to ash, escaped in the chaos, or was spirited away by loyal followers, no one could say. 2 weeks later, a physician in Baltimore was found dead in his home, his body posed in the posture of ascension, a note pinned to his chest. The Spirit sees all who betray its work. The trial was over, but the terror of the Ravencrofts had only begun to spread. The spirit that would not die, April 1852, should have marked the end. Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft, condemned for the torture and murder of hundreds, had been sentenced to hang. Their trial was the darkest spectacle of its age, a sermon of horror masquerading as justice. Yet the flames that consumed the Albany jail did not bring closure. They fanned the legend, the manhunt. For months after the fire, the largest manhunt in New York's history scoured the countryside. Posters bearing Ezra's sharp-eyed likeness were nailed to tavern doors and railway stations. Rumors spread faster than telegraphs. Some swore they saw him in Montreal disguised as a preacher. Others claimed he boarded a ship in Boston bound for Europe. A farmer outside Syracuse told of a black-eyed stranger who spoke of the purity of pain before vanishing into the woods. No sighting was confirmed. Silas's body was declared recovered, though many doubted the charred corpse truly belonged to him. Ezra was presumed escaped. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. No one knew. The murders, then came the killings. The first was Dr. Edward Mitchell in Baltimore, a physician who had testified about cadavers supplied by the church. His body was found in his study, posed in the grotesque position of ascension with a note pinned to his chest. The spirit sees all who betray its work. Within a year, 2 more physicians were killed the same way. One in Philadelphia, one in Boston. Each had connections to the Ravencroft case. Each was left arranged like a vessel. The message was clear. The spirit had disciples still. The wider. Webb federal investigator Daniel Blackwood continued to follow the trail, even after official interest waned. What he uncovered chilled him more than anything in the catacombs of Ravenwood. The Ravencrofts had not been isolated fanatics. They had corresponded with physicians, scholars, even wealthy patrons who saw in their research a grotesque potential. Letters seized from Silas's chambers revealed payments not just from medical schools, but from private collectors eager for specimens. Blackwood confided in his journal, "We have prosecuted only the visible tip of an enterprise. The brothers were not aberrations, they were instruments. Their hands may be stilled, but the hunger that guided them has not been extinguished." The garden. The most damning discovery came in late 1852, when Blackwood followed financial records to a farmhouse 40 miles from Ravenwood. They called it the garden hidden behind shuttered windows and false walls. Investigators found surgical tables, restraints, and notebooks filled with Silas's meticulous handwriting. But unlike the catacombs, the garden's focus had not been ritual. It had been experimentation. Children's shoes lay scattered in the dust. Cells lined the walls, some small enough for toddlers. In one locked trunk, investigators found bones, tiny, fragile, arranged as though for study. The horror of the garden convinced even the most skeptical that the Ravencrofts' crimes had not ended with their trial. But by then, Ezra was already a ghost, his trail cold, his shadow long. The echoes, the decades that followed, offered only fragments. In 1862, an abandoned church near the Vermont border was found with a hidden cellar. Inside were ritual carvings, chemical jars, and a journal signed by Ezra himself. The final line read, "The work continues. The spirit is patient." In 1879, a sect in Missouri calling itself the Children of Tribulation was uncovered. Their leader, Brother Elijah, was revealed to be a former Inner Circle member of Ravenwood. He slit his own throat when authorities closed in. In 1899, Harvard Medical School received an anonymous iron chest filled with journals in Ezra's distinctive hand. The final entry dated December 31st, 1898. Age has accomplished what the law could not. The vessel weakens, but the spirit does not die. Others will continue. If genuine, it meant Ezra had lived to 115. If a forgery, it meant someone wanted his voice to endure. Neither explanation was comforting. The legacy by the dawn of the 20th century, the Ravencroft case was no longer just crime. It was legend. Religious scholars cited it as a warning of cultic fanaticism. Medical ethicists invoked it when drafting the first codes regulating the use of cadavers. Psychologists studied it as a blueprint for mass manipulation. But in Ravenwood, there was no scholarship, only silence. The land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood was abandoned. The ruins were razed, the soil fenced off by the state. Locals whispered of unnatural quiet, of birds that never sang near the site, of nights when faint chanting echoed from beneath the ground. Children dared each other to touch the fence, then fled at the first gust of wind, and each year on the longest night of winter, some swore they saw lanterns moving in the trees, tracing a spiral pattern around the vacant lot. The twist in 1967, a team from the State University of New York conducted an archaeological survey of the site. They expected little. What they found shook even hardened academics. Buried deep in an uncollapsed section of tunnel was a sealed chamber. Inside were more bodies, scores of them, bringing the victim count to over 400. But more disturbing than the corpses were the papers preserved beside them. Plans, blueprints, not just for Ravenwood, but for other sites. Circles marked across, maps of the United States, notes in Ezra's hand, the first node, the second to bloom in time. The implication was clear. Ravenwood had never been intended as the whole. It had been only the beginning. The network had been meant to spread, and, perhaps, it had. The final image today, the land where the Church of the Pure Spirit once stood, is still fenced, still avoided. On certain nights when fog hangs low and the air is unnaturally still, locals say sound itself seems swallowed, as though the earth is listening. And if you linger too long near the boundary, some claim you will hear it. A low voice, whispering, from beneath the soil. Not Ezra's. Not Silas's. Something older. Something endless. A voice that says, "The Spirit is patient. The Spirit is everywhere. The work is never finished." The true horror of the Ravencroft case lies not in the brothers themselves, but in the truth they revealed. That charisma, authority, and belief can twist ordinary men into saints of suffering, that cruelty can be made holy with the right words, and that darkness does not die. It waits. And in the forests of upstate New York, where the ground still hides the bones of hundreds, that darkness waits still.